The visual is not important here. The music is not important here. The voice is not important here. What matters are the words. If you cannot listen to the words, you do not belong here. If you understand this, welcome to the Fate Club. There comes a point when time no longer presses forward with clenched teeth, when urgency dissolves not because circumstances improved, but because the internal mechanism that once translated time into pressure quietly disengaged, leaving minutes and hours intact yet strangely weightless, still passing, still measurable, but no longer demanding to be chased, defended, or conquered. This shift does not arrive with clarity or announcement, nor does it feel like relief in the dramatic sense, but more like the absence of a familiar tension that had been mistaken for life itself, a constant forward lean of the nervous system that once interpreted delay as danger and stillness as failure, until one day the body simply stops responding to that interpretation. Deadlines continue to exist in language and structure. Calendars remain filled. Clocks continue their mechanical repetition, yet something fundamental no longer translates these signals into urgency, as if the internal interpreter has grown tired of repeating the same warning for decades and finally chooses silence instead. At first, this silence can feel unsettling because urgency once served as proof of relevance, of participation, of being needed by the unfolding moment, and without it there is a brief sense of disorientation, as though time has opened a gap where reaction used to live. This gap is often misunderstood as laziness, apathy, or loss of ambition, but none of these descriptions are accurate because what actually dissolves is not movement but compulsion, not action but the invisible whip that once drove action forward under threat of imagined collapse. The organism does not stop functioning, yet it no longer accelerates by default, and this subtle deceleration exposes how much of previous motion was never chosen, only triggered, how often speed was mistaken for necessity, and how rarely urgency was questioned while it governed behavior. In this state, time begins to behave differently, not externally, but internally, expanding in places where it once felt compressed, slowing perception without slowing reality, allowing moments to register without being immediately converted into tasks, reactions, or narratives about productivity. The past loses some of its grip because it no longer serves as a reservoir of unfinished business demanding repayment, and the future loses its sharp edge because it is no longer treated as a courtroom where every present action will later be judged for efficiency or failure. This is not a rejection of consequence, nor an escape from responsibility, but a recalibration in which time is no longer perceived as an adversary that must be outrun to justify existence, and instead becomes a neutral medium through which experience simply passes. The body often reaches this adjustment before the mind does, showing signs of slowed reflexes, longer pauses before speech, delayed responses that are not errors but refusals to participate in unnecessary acceleration, as though the nervous system has recognized that constant readiness is no longer required for survival. Thoughts still arise, plans still form, decisions still occur, but they unfold without the previous sense of emergency, without the internal countdown that once framed every choice as a race against an invisible clock that could never be satisfied. This change is frequently triggered by prolonged exposure to repetition, by years of effort that produced outcomes but not meaning, by cycles of urgency that resolved into nothing more than the next cycle, until the system recognizes the pattern and quietly opts out of the demand. Time then reveals a different texture, one that was always present but inaccessible while urgency dominated perception, a texture in which moments do not stack aggressively toward a goal, but exist laterally, connected without hierarchy, allowing attention to rest rather than scan for threats. In this field, waiting no longer feels like loss, and slowness no longer carries moral weight, because the internal economy that once equated speed with value has stopped issuing currency, leaving previous transactions irrelevant. This does not create happiness or peace in any dramatic sense, but it removes a background strain that had distorted experience for so long it was considered normal, and its absence creates a neutral clarity that can feel empty at first, simply because tension had been mistaken for substance. Urgency once provided identity, shaping self-image around responsiveness, availability, and constant motion, and when it dissolves, identity loosens as well, no longer anchored to reaction time or output velocity, but floating without immediate replacement. This floating is often interpreted as uncertainty, but it is more accurately a suspension of premature commitment, a state in which the system no longer rushes to define itself through action before fully registering the conditions in which action would occur. Time in this state stops asking to be filled, stops demanding optimization, stops presenting itself as a scarce resource under constant threat of waste, and instead becomes abundant simply because it is no longer measured against imagined deficits. The environment does not change, but perception does, and with it the meaning assigned to duration, delay, and repetition, as if the mind has stopped translating temporal movement into existential pressure. This is not a peak experience, not an awakening moment, not a breakthrough to be claimed, but a gradual adaptation, similar to how eyesight adjusts to darkness without instruction, simply by ceasing to strain against what cannot be forced. Many resist this adaptation, attempting to reinstall urgency through artificial stress, overcommitment, or self-criticism, because the absence of urgency can feel like disappearance, as though existence itself depended on constant acceleration to remain visible. Yet the process continues regardless, because it is not governed by belief or preference, but by biological limits and accumulated exposure, by a nervous system that has learned, through repetition, that speed does not guarantee safety, meaning, or continuity. In this recalibrated state, time no longer threatens disappearance, because presence is no longer negotiated through haste, and being does not require constant demonstration through movement. Moments are allowed to complete themselves, conversations are permitted to unfold without racing toward resolution, and silence is no longer treated as a failure to perform, but as a valid interval in which nothing is demanded. The future still arrives, but it does not loom, and the past still exists, but does not chase, leaving the present unguarded, not as a sanctuary, but as an unpressured zone where experience is no longer evaluated by how quickly it transforms into outcome. This does not make life easier in a conventional sense, but it makes it less compressed, less distorted by the belief that time must always be managed, conquered, or redeemed through urgency. What emerges is not control, but allowance, not mastery over time, but detachment from the compulsion to negotiate with it constantly, as if every second carried a hidden demand. The system does not announce this change, nor does it ask permission, and often it goes unnoticed until someone realizes that nothing terrible happened during a pause that would once have felt dangerous. Time continues, but the demand for urgency quietly dissolves, leaving behind a rhythm that does not push, does not pull, and does not explain itself, simply unfolding without asking to be chased. If you understand this, welcome to the club.